Welcome to the Transformational Podcast, a conversation between brothers about practical ways faith is impacting our lives. We invite you to join us on this journey as we are learning to let faith transform the way we live. We are glad you are with us today and look forward to sharing our journey with you. Now let's jump in. All right, Chris, we're back and we're recording. And I can't wait to get into this one because we're going to be talking about husbands and marriage. And last week we set up the basically the start of this, and we really talked about humility. And if you haven't got a chance to read those books, I did put them in the show notes. They're excellent, so please go read those. I thought that for me it really changed some stuff. And you know, one of the funny things, Chris, you mentioned as we were finishing the podcast last week, and I said, hey, we're going to continue next week, husbands, and then we're going to do wives. And you laughed because you said we set a plan out, but it never works out because something always happens. Something's always amiss.
That's right. You know, plans change and there's always curveballs and things. And actually in your own life, you have a little bit of a curveball, a little change. So why don't you bring us all up to date with some of your life happenings?
Well, so we prayed that I would get a favorable no for that position that I interviewed for. And while the interview process turned in a little bit of a clown show where I interviewed with one guy, but it turned out the very next day it was somebody new. And then the following week, the other two candidates who were honestly just salt of the earth, awesome human beings and great people. When they did their interview, they didn't interview with the person that it was supposed to be. But bottom line, between that time and about 3 weeks later, over the Christmas and New Year's holiday, I got a call back to come do, basically come back and let's make sure that the new guy who hasn't met you doesn't hate you when he sees you. And so it was kind of funny because when I showed up, Chris, the guy starts, not him, but the guy I'm replacing, he starts saying, oh, when this and this and this. And I go, hang on, I'm going to have to stop you for a second. And he's looking at me like I'm crazy. I was like, let's start with, did I get the job or not? Like, what are we doing? What's the answer here before we move any further? He laughed. He goes, well, as long as you don't bomb that second interview, then yeah, you have it. And I had prayed downstairs where I was at. I prayed that if the Lord knew that our personalities, because we'll be working close together, didn't mix. In other words, that it was just a adverse or allergic reaction to each other. He'd make that obvious from the moment I walked in. And it was kind of funny. It was an answer to prayer because for the first 15 to 20 minutes of a 30-minute interview, probably 15 minutes, we talked about the fact that he was an avid musician. And all we talked about was music and my, growing up and his growing up and all this other stuff. So anyway, all that to say, yes, I'm starting this position. I'll start it probably April. And then we're kind of just figuring out how life fits into what's going to be a new battle rhythm for about a year. And you and I, we've been talking about this. So we're still committed to figuring this out. So we don't foresee this coming to an end, but there's some other things that honestly, if I'm just being honest with you, Chris, I'm having a little bit of a heart, I don't know. I'm torn in my heart about, some of the things that I have been doing, like our small group where they're young marrieds. And it's this, kind of this big family where I feel like I have a bunch of grandkids running down the house, even though I'm not old enough to be a grandfather.
Yeah,
I guess it means supposed. But I don't have any yet. But anyway, so that stuff might change, and we're praying through that and what that looks like when I start that in April. So that's the update. But today, that's not what we're talking about, despite our best efforts to walk down a rabbit trail. We want to jump into talking about husbands, right? And what Paul says, obviously, in his letter to the Ephesians. And I think we kind of wanted to, start in Ephesians 5, maybe verse 1 through 3, just to kind of do this setup, because it's always important when you jump in the middle of a letter. Like you explained last week, if you listened last week, this is a letter. It's been written from start to finish by Paul. He didn't break it up. We broke it up to make it easier to study and learn and memorize. So it's sometimes if we jump right in the middle of the letter, it misses some of the setup prior to it. We talked about humility last week, but let's talk about what he's calling us to, maybe starting at Ephesians 5, verse 1. What do you think?
Sure. Let's dive in. And I've got some thoughts. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. All right. So Ephesians 5:1, and I'm reading from an NIV Bible, says, "Be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God." And so I kind of wanted to start there, right? Because he's calling us to be imitators of God. And so today we want to talk about husbands and what's the husband's, what's God calling us to do or to be, who he's calling us to be in a marriage relationship. And we'll get later on into verse 29, 25. But I think this is where it starts, frankly. He's calling us to be imitators of God.
So I always like to dive into that. He says, imitate God in everything you do, but then he kind of gives you like the, here's what I mean statement. Live a life filled with love. Following the example of Christ, he loved us and offered himself as a sacrifice, right? So it wasn't, I think this is important because I don't like it when people are like, well, we just don't love each other anymore. Well, that was a choice, right? That's a decision. God loved us so much that he demonstrated his love by sending Jesus to lay down his life. God demonstrates his love for us through Jesus, right? Jesus says, no greater love has anyone than to lay down his life for his friends. So why is this so important?
Because frankly, Chris, like if you look at like Paul, right? He was calling Paul before he was Paul, he was Saul, right? So he was calling him even when he was a sinner, even when he was like the worst thing there. He didn't ask Saul to get himself, all fixed up. He called him out of that. And so it's easy to die for folks that we love and those that are around us, which means it should be all the more easier when we're serving our significant other, whether it's our wife or our husband in this case.
Right.
Jesus's demonstration actually is a step further than that.
Yeah, because I think it's interesting because I've heard of people talk about love account, right? You need to make deposits and withdrawals. And I really don't think that aligns with the example of Christ, because the reality is he just made full deposits and never waited for you to deposit, right? He offered, his love, no strings attached, no. And I think that's the problem, right? We naturally keep score, unfortunately.
Yep.
In which I think is interesting, because if you go over to that chapter that everybody likes to read at their wedding in 1 Corinthians 13, where it goes, love is patient, love is kind, right? And everybody loves it because it's so poetic and so pretty, right, when read.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, it's talking about the way the body of Christ, the way believers should interact. So it still comes back to the same thing we're talking about here, is that acting in the way that Christ acted so that we can be unified. Because ultimately, unity is essential for marriage. The two should become one, is what Jesus said. And what God has brought together, let no one tear asunder, let no one tear apart. And so if you think about it, he's saying, all right, here's the glue, here's the unity. It's love, but not like your worldly love that girl who's down on her luck, who goes home to help her parents' struggling business and runs into the...
Have you been watching Hallmark? What's going on over there?
Sorry. Yeah. I mean, it's the same play every movie, so it's pretty easy to figure it out. But reality is we have a pretty skewed view of love. And I'm going to say that, I'm picking on chick flicks, but I think males have a very bad skewed idea of love because we're an over-sexualized society.
Yeah.
It's everywhere we are. And so because of it, we are being programmed with unrealistic expectations of what love should be and what, and really what we're
Yeah.
doing is we're actually making our wives objects of pleasure. And that's not really what you see love being is you are there to satisfy my desires. And that's not the kind of love that Jesus demonstrated
Yeah.
for us.
He gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. It is a sacrificial love. It is a
Yep.
there's no, like, it's funny, Chris, for the longest time, the whole, what you were talking about with the bank, the love bank and the rest, um, it was probably, honestly, is kind of how I looked at it is, okay, well, I got to put some deposits in because, never know when you're going to need a withdrawal, whatever it is. And
Exactly. Yeah.
right. But the problem is that's not how Jesus did it. It's not certainly what he's calling us. And of course, right now they're talking body of Christ, but it becomes even more real when Paul transitions, and he transitions kind of starting in verse 15, when he transitions to start talking about wives and husbands. Now he has a little bit of a prelude into that because still he's talking about how we interact with each other in the church. But think about it, and this, at least think about it this way. If he's calling us to interact with that way with each other in the church, how much more should it be between us and our spouse, right? How much
Right.
more
Right.
so would it be, right?
Yeah. Because in the church, he's not saying the two became one. In the marriage, he says, this is why God said the man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two should become one flesh, right? That is the only relationship that God describes that way. And so yet he wants unity in the church, but how much more does he want unity in the
Yeah.
marriage?
And honestly, we're going to get more into that because Paul uses poetic language as he talks about Jesus's relationship to the church in comparison to marriage when he jumps into the marriage part. So that's why we really have to anchor here so that we can kind of understand. And, we were talking about that a little bit last week, is this idea that, you don't have to be married to understand the principle that's going on here, because that's the principle that was used to help folks understand the kind of love that God, honestly, the way Jesus interacts with the church more than anything else. So I don't
Right.
know if you want to jump forward, if you had thoughts, but I'm thinking either we jump into
Well,
15 or we jump into
l-
21.
let me go two more little quick points. So in First
Yeah, I get
Corinthians
it.
13, often referred to as the love chapter, where it talks about love is patient, love is kind, right? All those things.
Mm-hmm.
And once again, it's written as a letter to the Corinthians. In the very first sentence in 14:1, the very next chapter, he says, "Let love be your highest goal." Not
Yeah.
emotional, not sexual, but sacrificial, no strings attached, unearned, undeserved, uh, you know, love. It's a choice to demonstrate your love. And the way Jesus did was by laying down his life. And it makes me think of Philippians chapter 2 when he says, make me truly happy by agreeing wholeheartedly with each other, loving one another, working together with one mind and one purpose. And he's talking about the body of Christ, but it applies to marriage as well. Because then he goes, here's how. Don't be selfish. Don't make it all about you. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. Don't look out only for your own interest, but take an interest in others too. Don't be concerned about what you want. Really is kind of what he's saying. Be
Yep.
concerned about what others need. And he says, you must have the same attitude that Christ had. Though he was God, he did not think equality with God as something to cling to.
Mm-hmm.
I think we feel as if there's some rights, right, that we have. And
Oh,
yet he
yeah.
says instead he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being, right? I think marriage, so often we get into it. Robert, and I'm talking to myself here because I know the early days of marriage really were rough for me. And I think Julie would tell you the same. The first couple of years were just really rough for us. And it
Yeah.
was because I felt as if, well, I'm going to do these things and she's going to do those things. And,
Did
um,
you see it as like a almost like I want to say it was quasi transactional, and it's
oh,
like,
very
hey, if
much.
I do, I actually had a friend, Chris. It's pretty funny. Made me think of this, and so maybe you can relate. He used to talk about how he and his wife had blue and pink and purple. So he had blue and pink. That's basically blue jobs and pink jobs. Blue jobs are the things he was supposed to do. Pink jobs are the things she was supposed to do. And they had purple with the things that were kind of like mixed together, right? So for
Right.
him, a blue job was mow the lawn. For her, a pink job was doing the laundry. I mean, they made no bones about it. Like they weren't. It wasn't like they were chunking spears at each other. They literally set it up that way. And I thought to myself, I was like, how does that work? Because to me, now it's you've turned it into 100% transactional. Now I understand. We'll call it coordinating the chores of the house. I don't have a problem with that. But I think that sometimes that leads into us, I guess you could say expecting someone to it's this expectation of somebody pulling their weight is the way I'm going to use the
Yes, yes.
thing.
You know what's funny is that you gave me some marriage advice before I got married, and you probably don't even remember this.
Great.
But no, it's something that I thought about several times. As you said, hey, and actually you were deployed at the time, so this was over the phone at some point,
Okay.
and you just said, hey, there's going to be times in marriage that you feel like you're the one carrying the load, and you're doing all the stuff, and before you start feeling sorry for yourself, put on your big boy pants and keep towing.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And that's just because, and your point was that she's going to feel like that at times as well too.
Yeah.
And you just do your part. And it's funny because I don't know if you remember telling me that or not,
No, I
but
don't at all.
it,
But I have
it,
said
it
it on more than one occasion, so it sounds like me.
yeah, it was something that stuck with me because unfortunately, I think that we come into marriage, um, we get a sense of entitlement, right?
Yeah.
Of, well, I do all this. I mean, I've heard husbands say before, yeah, I do counseling from time to time. It's not my favorite thing to do because um, sometimes I just struggle to not tell them, hey, why don't you need to stop being childish. Um,
You have
but
to lead them
anywho,
down the path to you got to
yes,
stop acting like a 2-year-old.
yes.
Without saying just don't act like a 2-year-old.
Why don't you care about your wife? How about
Yeah.
that? Anyway,
That's
but
the
there'll be,
that's the benefit of the Marine Corps. We can
yeah,
look at each other and go, "Hey, what are you doing? You're acting like a you're acting like a teenager.
right.
Get your head out of your
Quit throwing a temper
posterior."
tantrum, grow up a
Yeah.
little bit, Anyway,
Anyway.
so
Yeah.
so well, they'll be like, well, I provide for this family, and she
Mm.
should do, It's like, whoa, 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 whoa. What we're about to get into, Robert, like, is anti that attitude of I've done this and I do. She should be thankful for me. Is really
Chris.
the attitude. And Robert, I've had that attitude before
Yeah.
too. I'm not judging anybody. I've had the attitude of, man, she's got it pretty good, and which is so prideful, right? Go back to humility. We talked about that last time, but it's like, if she only knew how good she had it, right? Because, which
Man,
is horrible. It's
you're
horrible. I'm
hitting you're
saying
hitting
out
close to
loud.
home. No,
I'm
no, you're hitting close to home. I feel it.
I'm
It
saying out loud what maybe I should have just kept in, but I feel like there's other people who've walked down that road before, and they're
yeah.
going, "Yeah, I've felt that way before." So,
And honestly, like for me, let's be real for a second. Like I end up down that road on more times than I like to imagine. It's been 22 years and I still find myself on that road where I'm looking over and I have to like remind myself is that's not the way this works. And, remind myself that when it calls us to love our wives as Christ loved the church, Christ didn't get anything in return for
right,
loving the church.
right.
Like there was nothing in it for
Well,
him.
he got something. It just
Yeah.
wasn't good. He got a
Right. Yeah.
cross. He got
Yeah.
nailed to a cross for it.
Yeah.
That's what love cost him.
Yeah.
And last I checked, I've not had to do that. So, and nor would it be worth it
Yeah.
because it wouldn't have the same effect. But at the same time, that's the kind of picture that we're about to dive into because when it comes down to it, and I think it's interesting. We're gonna we're going to dive into what it talks about our role is, and how this marriage is to function.
Yeah, he gave us complementary roles, and we could start in Genesis if we want, and you can always go back and look at that. But I think we should start at verse 21, and then let's just read through the passage. I'll let you do the reading, so if you feel
Okay,
like you need to stop, let's do that.
sure.
But let's at least try to get through verse 26. If
Yeah,
you could, that's your goal.
yeah.
Yeah.
So this is, it says, and further, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. I love that verse because that's the verse that people like to skip. They like to
Yeah, they
jump to the
do.
next. Then when I say people, a lot of the men that I've talked with, she's
Yeah.
supposed to submit to me. I'm like, back up one verse. And it says, and
Right.
it's further, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. I'm going to pause there and just say, man, that is a setup for what we call a submission competition. It is a
Mm-hmm.
race to the end of the line.
Yeah.
It is putting her first, putting him first. It is a submission competition. What's so fascinating is in the original Greek, when it gets to verse 2, for wives, this means submit to your husbands as to the Lord. I'm going to pause there and say, women often don't like it because men often are the ones going, well, scripture says you're supposed to submit. And I'm just going to tell men, we're going to dive into this in a second. If you're having to say that, then you haven't done your job.
Yeah.
If you're having
Yeah.
to say, I'm the leader, then you haven't led well.
No,
Um,
you're right. We talk about
and
that we talk about that even in my own profession, right?
right,
If you have
right,
to tell people you're the leader, buddy, you've done it's you're not doing it right.
right. Do you
And
want compliance or commitment? What are you looking for?
and
Uh,
frankly, what's funny about that verse, submit to each other before it gets to wives submitting to husbands, is a call for us in the church to submit to each other, which is that is a which we talked about last week. That is a active step in humility. It's an
yes, yep,
active step in humility,
yep. And
right?
so,
Not thinking ourselves more. So go ahead.
so, so,
By the
um,
way, we only got one verse in.
yeah, I struggle when I get into
No,
this
it's
stuff
good.
because
Made me
I
laugh.
love it.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because what's cool about this is in verse 22 in the original language Greek. Once again, we're the ones who put the verse numbers and chapter numbers there for studying purposes. But that actually those two sentences actually go together because it actually says, "And for wives, this means to your husbands," is the original way it said. It doesn't even have the word submit there, but it's referencing it is building off the verb in the previous sentence when it says, for wives, this means to submit to your husbands as to the Lord. So, wives, that doesn't mean you don't need to submit. It's just the way they wrote in Greek. It's saying, and really, that word submit, unfortunately, because it has been used the way it has been used, um, it's it's misunderstood to some degree. It's seen as a bad thing, as a negative thing, but really, it is a well, for one, it requires humility, but it is a willingness um, to to put the other person first, right? To demonstrate what Jesus did when he came to earth. It is literally reflecting the attitude of Christ.
Yeah, because
And
see, there's a difference between submission and subjection, right?
right,
And
right,
so
right,
that's I think what you're trying to get at is he's not calling for subjection, he's calling for being submissive in the same way that in it, and I'm going to quote it as um, as to the Lord, right?
right,
And
right.
so the reason why it's important to back it up and say, "Hey, we're submitting to each other," that is there, and it goes on to, say that at the end of that, wives should submit to the husbands and everything. That's partly because God's a God of order. He sees us as complementary, but He has a call to the husband in this next piece, which is really what we're talking about.
Yeah,
Which is it has nothing to do with being a lord.
yeah,
It has to do with sacrificing our selves with nothing, expecting nothing in return.
yep.
And
So let
that's
me
that's where it gets hard, man. Because I mean, if I'm putting in the work, if I'm putting in the hours, I want to get paid.
right.
And it,
Right.
and that's
And
hard.
which comes back to entitlement and in my expectations, right? I've done this, so I deserve this in return. And that's where we've got to go against our wiring. He goes on and says, for a husband is head of his wife, as Christ is head of the church. He is the savior of the body, the church. As the church submits to Christ, yields itself to the leadership of Christ, so you wives should yield to the leadership of your husbands in everything. And then verse 25, because this is the part we need to get to. For husbands,
This is where we've been trying to get, but we're almost there. We're almost there.
Yeah.
Because we're going to come back. So don't worry. We're not skipping the hard stuff. We're going to come back to it. But we think that that verse 22 and through 24, it's better seen through the lens of these next few verses.
Yeah. It says, for husbands, this means love your wives just as Christ loved the church. He gave up his life for her. He laid it down. He died to himself. Let me think of other ways I can say that, right? He gave up his life for her to make her holy, clean, washed by the cleansing of God's word. Now look at that. It was not for his good. It was for hers.
Man,
he
I tell you what,
his life
I'm
down.
like, I get the goosebumps thinking about it, right? Because you're right. It had nothing to do with him. It was for the benefit of her.
It was for what was best for her. And Robert, I think this is where we struggle as husbands sometimes, because we want our wife we want to serve our wife so that we can get what we feel like is best for us. And shouldn't be our heart, shouldn't be our intention, but we're human. And that's how we're hardwired, because we think, well, she needs to do these things, because if she'll do these things, then in the long run, it benefits me. But Jesus was like, she needs to do these things. The church needs to do these things because that's what's best for her. Yeah. That's what's best for the church.
Yeah. And you know what's funny, Chris, on that one is a lot of times when we get into that, right? So we get into this attitude, and I'm going to tell you right now, I'm telling myself, when I get all in, right, and I start, pushing, I'm doing all this, and I'm doing that, and I start listening to the things that I'm doing, and I'm getting frustrated with her. What I can tell you is I have taken my eyes off Christ and I've put my eyes on her. And
right.
I've now elevated her. I've actually made her an idol.
Yeah.
Because the only person that can give me what I need, what I'm looking for, isn't her. It's actually God.
No.
And so when I have that expectation, you said early on in the podcast that it's a lot of times it's these unmet expectations, right? I always jokingly say, hey, let me tell you the definition of disappointment. Unmet expectations, right?
Right.
Well, the problem is we're expecting her to fulfill a role that God is supposed to fill a role that Jesus is supposed to fill. So anyway.
Well, and so I just want to say, I think what happens is when we do get disappointed, we get frustrated, we can let them know about it, right? And it's interesting because over in Colossians, God tells us through Paul in Colossians 3:19, he says, husbands, love your wives and never treat them harshly, right? Here's what I think is interesting, and is that what he tells the husband is lead you like Jesus did. That's what he's saying. Lead your wife like Jesus, with love, with sacrifice, with service, right? Mm-hmm. You shouldn't serve your wife so that you can have sex. You should serve your wife so she feels loved and cherished, and that she feels cared for, right? Whether, you should be the head dishwasher, floor sweeper, laundry folder, gas pumper, bed maker, toilet scrubber, carpet cleaner, kid wrangler. I listen, guys who listen. I'm about to get on a horse, man. Because guys whose wives, there's something, an event for women at the church, and they're like, well, we have to provide childcare because the guys don't know what to do with the kids. I'm like, what? They signed up for this.
Yeah,
they were there. They were there when it happened. I know it. All right. Yeah, This is part of it. Like you signed up to be a dad.
Yeah.
And it should not be something you do begrudgingly. Children are a blessing from God, and you get 18 years of your life, which is
Yeah.
small, to prepare them and launch them out and send them into the world. The problem is that we look at it and go, well, that's the wife's job. Wrong, right? And
Yeah.
when your wife wants to go do something, and man, say absolutely, I got it covered. I mean, here's the thing. It's just when it comes to leading like Jesus, I believe this. If you lead like Jesus, your wife will want to follow,
No,
right?
I agree.
Because who wouldn't want to follow a man who loves like Jesus, who lays down his life, who is selfless, who's always putting her best interests ahead of his own, right?
Yeah.
I just believe, and it may not be overnight. And this was funny. I've had people be like, "Well, I tried that, it just didn't work."
Right.
What do you mean it didn't work? What was that desired outcome? And I think this is where we've got
Because
to
that's
change.
the point. Hang on, that's the point. It didn't work, right? So there was a
Right.
desired outcome. You
Right.
still think you're putting change into the machine to get the little prize out at the end.
That's exactly
and that's
right.
the problem.
Yeah,
That's the problem.
Because the thing is, Robert, the goal is not to get the prize out. The goal is to honor God, for God to go, wow, you loved your wife well. Well
Yeah.
done. You know what? When our wives are meeting all our needs, it's really easy to love them.
Yeah.
But when they aren't necessarily in line with where we feel like they should be or need to be, that's actually when the Jesus kind of love has to be demonstrated.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think we've got to change the scoreboard as men and quit thinking that success in marriage is a hot sex life, bro. I mean,
yeah.
why do we even think that? Well, because we've watched too many things on television, listened to music we probably shouldn't have. We filled our mind with sexual things that have objectified our wives and made them objects of our pleasure. At the end of the day, did God invent sex? Is it a wonderful thing? Absolutely. I'm not talking bad about sex. I'm just saying that sex was made for marriage. Marriage was not made for sex. We've gotten the cart before the horse. So anyway, sorry, I'm fired up, and we got to probably.
No, we're not there yet, because I do want to tangent for a second, because it kind of connects to what you're saying. So you're right. It is. We should have that love that is described here in Ephesians 5. Now, one of the things, and maybe we'll read some more later in the next one. I don't know where this is going to go, but if you notice, Chris, verses 22 is really where it talks about wives submit, right? There's verses 22 to 24. Now they broke it up. It's only 3 verses, 22, 23, 24. Paul then turns and actually spends the rest of his time talking to husbands, telling husbands from verse 25 all the way down into basically verse 32. So he spends the bulk of the rest of the time addressing the husband, saying, just like you talked about, we need to change the scoreboard and the whole 9 yards. Now, I think you would agree with me when I say this, because we talk about this at our small group. To a certain extent, it is not a bad thing to go to a marriage conference, read a marriage book together, talk about your, we'll call it your love language, and your, what it is that, how you can, show each other, learn how each other receives love so you can show it the best. I call it putting tools in the marriage tool bag. Nothing wrong with that. And frankly, you should do that.
Yeah.
What happens is, like you said earlier, is we get to this thing where we go to the marriage conference and we're like, well, I did my part and they didn't do theirs. That wasn't why you went to the marriage conference. You went to the marriage conference.
Or was it?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. That's the heart issue we've got to look at.
Right.
And start
because
going,
what we do is we're like, I put tools in my tool bag, but she didn't put any tools in her tool bag.
You're right.
That's not what God's calling you to do.
Because the thing is the goal to honor God is the goal to get what you want.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it enough? Is it enough for you that God would look at you and say, well done? Yeah. You loved her like Jesus. Is that enough?
Well, we talked about this last night, Chris, and we talked about this in our small group. The idea that start with the end in the mind, right? So you're standing before the Lord and he says, what did you do with your marriage? Right. And he talks about blessings. He talks about, these things that God does for us, and he promises to bless us. Start with that in mind, and then work it back and go, am I doing things right now that invest in my marriage, invest in my wife, invest in my kids, so that when I stand in front of God, he'll be like, hey man, you did pretty good. Like that's what I was calling you to do, because it was this selfless love. It was this love that sacrifices, and it expects nothing in return, in the same way I expected nothing from the church.
Yep.
So that's, I think we probably need to just kind of stop there, because we could probably rant for a little bit, but we're going to try not to do that. Because you mentioned you had a rough start. We did cycles, so we did rough cycles, right? So, we're like, every 3 to 5 years, right? Like, right. And so, but God's it was about year 15. And this is, I think, hopefully will give folks hope. God changed the way I saw marriage, and he changed the way I viewed conflict in marriage.
Yeah.
He more or less normalized it. It happens. Like, we're human, and that's what's going to happen. But we need to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. We need to do our part. We need to walk through it and expect that God will bring us, bring unity back into it. And so if you're a husband and you're like, what in the world? Again, you're not going to find the tools in your tool bag so that you can elicit some payback. You're doing it because God called you to.
Yeah.
And he wasn't joking around, and he didn't have any he just called you to. And that's the end. That's the end of the line. So Chris, over to you for like, I guess you say closing remarks.
Here's what I'd say.
What's your closing words?
Is that if you'll change the scoreboard and you turn it to, I want to honor God in the way that I love and serve my wife. I'm just telling you, it makes marriage better, because it's not dependent on her response. It's dependent on me just doing what God told me to do. And it is so stinking fulfilling.
Amen.